Hey gang, today we're gonna do Threefold, Section 3, Part 6. Alright, here we go. When you get to Lunaria, Jaxson said, Mateo's all yours. Get your job done. Mateo watched Guinness's body fall to the ground. Why didn't you let him do it? Mateo asked. He kept his eyes on Guinness. Why didn't you let him kill me? Because you know this is about more than just him or his revenge, Jaxson said in a low voice. He turned toward Mateo, but he looked past him over his shoulder. His thoughts were on Junyo. Mateo gazed upon Hugo as he made his way toward Guinness. You're right, I know. Guinness raised his head as much as he could. He watched Mateo become a figure of light and disappear. Jaxson lifted him and dropped him in front of him with his arrow energy. He bit down close to his ear. If you don't do what you're told, Teresa will die at my hands. Afterward, he looked him in his eyes. Guinness glared in return and reached out to grab him. Jaxson became a figure of light and disappeared. Guinness grit his teeth from the immense pain, physical and emotional. He examined his hands and arms. He felt like he had been on fire, but his skin, it was red, burned from the ice flames, stinging and cold at his touch, too. He ignored it. What Jaxson said took over his mind. Teresa, Guinness said under his breath. Teresa was in danger because of Mateo. He wanted to call on Mateo if it meant protecting Teresa, but calling him would be pointless because Mateo wouldn't come. He let himself fall onto his back. He glanced at the package for Junyo. Doing as instructed was his only choice. He glanced toward Evergard. All traces of the ice flames disappeared with Jaxson. He closed his eyes. He tried not to think about his body or his failures. He was the cause of the ice fire, Hugo said. He had come to his side. You met Jaxson. You fought him. He saw the redness of his skin and his clothes frozen to his skin. He did this. Guinness's eyes were glazed over. Jaxson, Mateo, you're with him. For what reason? Guinness, Hugo called to him. Guinness blinked. He saw Hugo, who leaned on his knees and tried to catch his breath. Hugo used his pyro energy. The usage affected him. He glanced at Hugo's face and noticed his chain again. He noticed the crest at the end of it. He recognized the Ujat symbol. Hugo waited for some kind of response. After a short silence, he decided he could admit defeat to someone like Jaxson because it was obvious he'd been defeated. He's responsible for it all, he said slowly. Ignoring the pain Jaxson inflicted on him grew impossible. He couldn't move because of it. Hugo examined his skin, which stung like he had been frostbitten. Hugo appeared deep in thought and concerned about him, or at least the situation. He had a hard time deciding what probably left Hugo more concerned, his injuries or Jackson's actions. I explained the situation to the townspeople, Junyo said, joining them. The magistrate witnessed my efforts to protect Evergard. Due to this, she believed my explanation, but asked we leave immediately. Can't blame her, Guinness said. He regretted the short laugh that escaped him. He recognized the yin-yang symbol Junyo wore around his neck. His crest contained the fleur-de-lis symbol. He wouldn't let Junyo think him weak and tried to sit up or stand up, but Hugo stopped him with a firm hand. Hold on, Hugo said. Someone needs to take a look at him. He went up against Jaxson. He tried to take him on, Junyo said, even though he knew he would not win. Guinness's eyes went to Junyo, a silent fury in his chest. He decided to ignore his comment. He wanted to punch him, but now wasn't the time. I'm all right, Guinness said, but he couldn't lift his arms to push Hugo back. He fixed his eyes on Hugo. They don't want us around. I can hold off until we reach another city or town. How you gonna manage that shit? You still can't move. He cannot reach another city, Junyo said. He cannot stand, for that matter, because of Icefire's effects. He continued to speak with Hugo and ignore him. Guinness felt he reached his lowest of lows. He had never been this pathetic, utterly defeated. Even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. I imagine he's still a tough opponent, Hugo said to him. When we were younger, not many could take him. Don't take this loss personally. He's gotten better since then. Hugo didn't look proud of Jaxson. He looked like he was merely stating facts. Guinness wouldn't take it personally. If anything, Junyo and Jaxson showed him he had to train harder, if he hoped to face Mateo in the future. This proves it, Hugo said. If you two had any doubts, this proves Jaxson, Akura, and Mateo are working together. Junyo nodded. Guinness agreed, but did nothing to indicate his agreement. He just wished it made sense. Which means, Hugo said, we need to work together to find out what this is all about. If we can't go into Everguard, I'll try my pyro energy. He looked serious until he looked like he felt guilty. Guinness didn't believe Hugo blamed himself. He had no reason to blame himself. He realized, however, blaming himself for Jackson's actions seemed like something Hugo might do. If Jaxson controlled Icefire, he was unhinged. Not many pyro energies could generate Icefire. Becoming a genetic Cyro energist supposedly required mastery of pyro energy and a complete understanding of who you were. Guinness remembered this from school. He also remembered most people who became Cyro energists were insane. People never knew if either was a trigger for the other. Either Jaxson became insane, which granted him the use of Cyro energy, or he became a Cyro energist and it led to his insanity. Hugo didn't realize this or chose to ignore it. From what Hugo said earlier, he gathered Hugo planned to confront Jaxson about everything and have him explain himself. This reminded him of what Desiree told him. I hope before you try and hurt your brother, you try to talk to him about what happened. There are always multiple sides to a story. They needed to work together. He doubted he'd work with Hugo and Junyo, but with Teresa in danger, he would listen and do everything Jaxson told him to do. What are you going to do with your pyro energy? Guinness asked Hugo. He struggled with his words as he lost feeling in his legs and arms. Earlier, you said you couldn't use it. Suddenly, you're an expert. I saw the flames, Junyo said. You gained some control. How are you going to help him using your pyro energy? Guinness was right, Hugo said. Guinness glanced over at Junyo and grinned at seeing the frown on his face. How so? Junyo asked, as if he'd rather shoot himself in the leg than believe those words. He could see that in his face and grit his teeth because of it. He didn't care much about how Hugo managed to use his pyro energy, but he wanted that look off Junyo's face. You were both right, Hugo said, as if he could sense the tension between the two of them. It must have been the fact Hugo noticed the expressions on their faces. Do something, or we will have to take him into town, Junyo said. He might not want to admit it, but his body is going numb as we speak. Guinness frowned, but he said nothing because it was true. Hugo smiled and laughed after he glanced from Junyo to him. He rubbed his hands together and brought a flame into his right hand. He watched it with the intent to put it to work. The flame leapt from Hugo's hand and traveled across his arms and hands and drew the red and sting from them. A moment later, the flame engulfed his entire body. He felt no pain, but feeling returned to his legs, arms, and finally his body. He watched his clothes thaw and dry. Hugo dispersed the flames when he finished. Guinness stood impressed. Not many pyroenergists could do that. Hugo healed him. Thanks, Guinness said and meant it. He waited to get an answer to Junyo's question. He also wanted to know how Hugo did that and how he knew he could do it. No problem, Hugo said and smiled. Friendly and less serious, Hugo had returned. Having recovered his breath earlier, he tried to catch his breath again. His work done, he sat on the ground and rested. He exhausted a lot of his pyro energy, his soul energy, which happens when you start working with a new element. Since when can pyro energies heal people? Guinness said. He and Junyo watched Hugo notice the package lying on the ground before he picked it up. What did Jaxson ask you to do? Hugo asked. He turned toward him. Guinness is the next part of their plan, Junyo said. We cannot discuss this here. They are watching us. We must leave. The three young men glanced toward the town to see the townspeople standing watch. Guinness watched Hugo climb to his feet and bow to them. He figured it was his way of apologizing. Junyo walked off. Hugo moved after him with the package, and he followed them after he grabbed his axe off the ground. He went over what he would say. He wouldn't mention Jackson's threat. He would handle that himself. The crest, this supposed secret plan, and the interaction between Mateo and Teresa knocked around his head. Hugo and Junyo each had a crest, but they didn't know their importance. Jaxson, Akira, and Mateo were working together. Mateo brought him into something outside their business. Mateo said, when you learn the truth, don't be surprised. Teresa was smart. She wouldn't have left with Mateo without a good reason. The truth behind Mateo taking their old man's life and the truth behind this plan could be related, but he couldn't see how either worked together. Hugo and Junyo's involvement made even less sense. I thought I didn't have a trigger, Hugo said, but I guess I do. After so many years of neglect, I wasn't sure I could use my pyro energy. Something held me back. My trigger and what held me back became clear to me today. Fire is not in you, Junyo said. Fire isn't him. That much was obvious. He had met too many pyro energists to think otherwise. Jaxson was a prime example of the pyro energist he knew. You're right, Hugo said. He laughed. I remember my family members who mastered pyro energy before me. I was nothing like them. Guinness agreed until he thought about it. Jaxson displayed the wild, violent, and heartless nature of fire. Men he'd fought before had done the same with their elements. Because he'd fought as much as he did, hands-on experience in school taught him that each element existed on a spectrum, and people could use elements in any way possible. People's characters affected what element they developed and its development. But fire could be Hugo. He didn't know Hugo well enough to say whether that was true. It wasn't me, Hugo said, so I didn't want to use it. After a while, I hadn't used it for so long, I thought I couldn't use it. What? Guinness said, surprised to hear his own response. What are you getting at? I don't care, but what the fuck are you trying to say? Hugo laughed. Junyo shot him a look. Hugo might be as unhinged as Jaxson. Jaxson mentioned they were similar in some way. My dad, brother, and a number of my relatives on my mother's side are tough, mind blowing energies, Hugo said. On my father's side, pyro energy is a big deal. No one expected me to become a pyro energist after I exhibited my geo energy. I didn't expect it either. When I did, I didn't think I deserved it. I didn't think I could live up to it. I didn't want to try. I was content with my geo energy. You are crazy, Guinness said. You got this powerful ability and you chose to ignore it? What makes him crazy? Junyo asked coldly. When Junyo addressed him, he surprised him and Hugo. Without power, Guinness said, you can't change anything. Junyo's attitude didn't piss him off. He wanted to answer his question, so he and Junyo could hear his answer. Strength gives you control of your world and your life. Junyo, you understand that, but Hugo, you don't. I do, Hugo said. Jaxson taught me that lesson. I decided I'm not much for controlling my world or my life. Those are out of my control. I take life as it comes. Doesn't mean I'm not strong. He didn't understand Hugo's response, which must have come across in his expression. Strength comes in a variety of different forms, Hugo said. The knowing and content expression on Hugo's face made him wonder what he meant. An idea struck him. To Hugo, he and Junyo were people who believed and relied on their own strength. Jaxson undoubtedly thought the same way. Hugo believed and relied on others. That had to be it. It had been evident in how Hugo roped them into handling the Everguard situation. Even if he couldn't do anything, Hugo knew they could and depended on them. That was one way of looking at strength. Hugo's way. Seeing that column of ice fire, Hugo said, hearing Guinness in pain and knowing Everguard was in trouble reminded me of the day I became a pyro energist. Guinness was going to make a comment about Hugo annoying him with his dramatic story, but didn't when Hugo mentioned hearing him in pain. He hoped no one heard. He gazed at his hands. Jaxson could have done worse. If he had, he wouldn't have been able to do anything about it. That whole situation hadn't been about the fight. It had been about him listening. He could have prevented the pain he incurred if he had listened. But Jaxson knew he wouldn't. Seeing Mateo, he became erratic. If Mateo didn't have that effect on him these days, he probably wouldn't have had to endure Jackson's flames. That's what he believed. After he finished with his business and saved Teresa, he'd put Mateo and his own life back in place. When I was about 8, Hugo said, my mother fell sick. She almost died. I remember everyone telling me to be strong. I was the one crying every 5 seconds. No one could figure out what was wrong with her, but our family stayed positive. They were sure she would pull through it. After we found out that wouldn't be the case, I saw my dad and brother cry for the first and only time. You can imagine I was devastated. I didn't want to let her go. You use your pyro energy to heal her, Guinness said. I had to trigger my pyro energy by solving the problem that held me back, Hugo said, answering Junyo's question. Whenever things look impossible, I will myself to make things happen. I can't explain it, but situations tend to work out for me. Realizing this allowed me to access my pyro energy. Force of will. That's how you got your hero complex, Guinness said. A dangerous way of thinking, Junyo said. I've heard that before, Hugo said. I'm aware of the consequences. You're in, Guinness began before Hugo beat him to it. I'm an idealistic idiot, Hugo said. You're not the first to tell me, trust me, but it's who I am. Idealistic. I'm not an idiot. Guinness couldn't believe it. He agreed with Junyo. Hugo's way of thinking was dangerous. I'm not saying don't help people, but if you run off trying to solve everybody's problems and help everyone you see, in the end, it'll be bad for you. If people can do nothing because they don't care, Hugo said, they're afraid or they don't want to. I understand. I'm just not one of those people. Guinness shook his head. He didn't understand them. At the end of the day, he didn't need to either. If you hadn't turned out to be a pyroenergist, you would have been powerless to stop the ice fire. He didn't say that, though, not out loud. We'll agree to disagree, Hugo said. Guinness did have to admit, though, at this point, Hugo had the right and the ability to do what he did. Tired of having this conversation, he gave his final word on it. You'll learn. Alright, guys, that was part 6. Tomorrow we'll do part 7. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a good one.